So let me know you want me to
Good.
start.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
good.
good.
All right, let's go. All right. Albert Einstein told us that condemnation without investigation is the height of ignorance. And yet in workplace, serious and fatal incidents, blaming human actors is a default for both internal and external investigators. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast. My name is Alex Smirniotis from LexisNexis, and I'm joined by Paul Verrico and Charlotte Wood from Eversheds Sutherland to understand more about blame, mitigations, and analysis of investigations. Paul, Charlotte, tell us a bit about why you are the people to discuss this.
Yeah, sure. So, hi everybody. I'm Paul Verrico. I'm the global head of the Eversheds EHS business. We're one of the world's largest law firms, and we typically get involved to help large and very large organisations when things go wrong, and tragically wrong. And for the last 20 years, my career has been a series of disasters. I've helped organisations when they've experienced workplace fatalities, significant environmental harm. I've dealt with many of the matters that have been in the public eye, both in the UK and more globally. And we've built up a deep expertise in helping organisations investigate and avoid some of the common pitfalls that we see on a day-to-day basis. I was trying to tot up before this podcast how many investigations I've been involved in. It'll be north of 400. And so there's a great breadth of experience that we can bring to this subject.
And Charlotte?
Yeah, so just expanding on what Paul said, so we're instructed by clients in all sectors, both fatal and serious workplace incidents. And the kind of work types that we get involved in are, as I said, many sectors, but we undertake legally privileged investigations to understand the root and underlying causes. And as part of that, we'll review huge amounts of documents, we'll interview key witnesses in a human way, and we'll also prepare a legally privileged investigation report. And what's really critical is we help clients build safety improvement plans and work with the on-site teams to develop those and implement those across the site over the course of a number of months.
And you both work in the UK?
We both work in the UK, yeah. We are an international team, and we have global mandates as well.
Yeah, I spent most of the time through COVID in Hong Kong, working on a significant outcome following a triple fatality over there. And one of the things that we find that's quite interesting is the dynamic of power. So depending upon which jurisdiction you work within, there'll be a different understanding as to whether you blame somebody on the sharp end or whether there's a deeper systems investigation. We find that typically in the UK, Australia, some of the US, there's a greater desire to look a bit deeper, whereas perhaps in Asia in particular, there is more of a find the people who didn't follow the rules culture. And what we're really all about is trying to help organisations learn lessons so they don't make the same mistakes again, and so that other organisations can see what's gone wrong and learn from it without having to experience the pain of a fatal, of a very serious accident.
So
I think that's sorry. I think that's where we are very good. An investigation will kind of look at the root and underlying causes, but we go beyond that and we look at the systems issues as well, which has really benefited clients. We don't just focus solely on the incident and what's happened.
So knowing this, so you defend organizations following deaths at work. So do you have any example of the types of cases that you've worked on in the past?
Yeah, so we've worked on quite a lot of cases. So falls from height, collapse of buildings, incidents where workers have unfortunately been trapped in conveyors. We've worked where Paul, you might have to dip in here.
So we've worked on all kinds of cases. The ones that you might have heard about, we've got a role in Grenfell, the tower in London.
Yeah.
We were involved in Deepwater Horizon for one of the parties following that. And we kind of cut our teeth as a team on the rail disasters in the UK 20 years ago. So we have I suppose, a corporate CV of very large incidents. And Charlotte, we've also been involved in some kind of, I hate to say kind of traditional health and safety work, but the kind of single fatality cases where people have succumbed to fairly common hazards.
Yeah. you want me to expand on what those are?
So let's just roll that bit
What?
again.
But what can we?
So look, I'll do the Transocean Grenfell train wrecks, and then you come in and go, yeah, and of course there's unfortunately people die in tragically repeatable ways. For instance, Fulton Height, vehicle pedestrian, and we act for household name clients on those across Europe. Yeah.
I'm not sure what we could talk about. That was all, because I'm thinking, oh God.
No. I think we can talk about people dying in single fatalities in exactly the same kind of ways. So let's do that. Okay. So do you want to ask the question again?
Yeah. So I'll do so you defend organizations. So I'll start with the knowing this, make it conversational, etc. Okay, easy. All right.
Yes, you better get your editing hat on. Go
on. So knowing this, so you defend organizations following deaths at work. So can you share some examples of the types of cases that you've worked on in the past?
Yeah, sure. So while many of the client names are confidential, I can kind of maybe give you a flavour of some of the large cases that you've heard about. So Evershed Sutherland was involved in acting for one of the parties on Deepwater Horizon when there was the disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. We are currently acting for parties at Grenfell. That's the tower block in London where there was a fatal fire that killed many people. We cut our corporate CV working on the rail disasters 25 years ago in the UK. So we've acted on some very big ticket items. But Charlotte, we've also acted on some kind of single cause fatality cases.
Yeah, so unfortunately, people do die in single fatalities in a similar way. It's a common instance that we've been involved in our Fulton Heights workplace transport, gas explosion, and across both England, Wales, and Scotland, so internationally as well.
So given that experience and the different types of matters that you've had to deal with, what government or regulatory bodies are involved where there's been a serious accident like a death?
So the police will investigate first for corporate manslaughter or gross negligence manslaughter, and if they do establish that there's a gross breach of duty owing to the corporate system, owing to the corporate individuals, they will then progress with that. What tends to be the case is that it's very difficult to kind of meet that test of gross breach of duty. So they hand it over to the regulator. That will either be the health and safety executive or the local authority, depending on where the incident has happened.
We see the same across Europe, where it will be a police-led investigation following a death. There's normally a domestic regulator. And of course, when we look at our friends over the pond, the bigger concern tends to be the civil case rather than the regulatory case. But certainly in the UK, particularly, it's a criminal jurisdiction, and so it's a police and regulatory investigation.
Yeah.
So before we started the podcast, you both said getting a scope right and terms of reference is super important. Help me with that.
Yeah, so when there's been an incident, we are the first port of call for clients, so that they will call us up and ask for help in the immediate aftermath. So getting the scope and the terms of reference is critical from the outset to understand who's going to be involved with the investigation at a local level, and that helps in order to determine who is going to support both the evidence gathering at a local level, but also to ensure that the investigation is captured by legal privilege, which means that it's not automatic. The report and the findings aren't automatically disclosable to the regulator. So setting out kind of who the stakeholders are, who we are advising, and also timescales. So when there has been an incident, it's very quick in terms of the regulatory intervention. So there needs to be timescales in terms of when we are interviewing people, when we need the documents by, but also when the report needs to be completed. We will also look at the incident site, but if we expand and look at other sites as well, we need to work out where those sites are going to be.
Yeah, it's quite often the case, Alex, that you'll find a quite worrying failure in one site. So maybe it's a failure of a risk assessment process or a failure of training. And for a large multinational, The real burning question is that replicated across various sites? Because if it's an organizational failing or a culture problem, then really the organisation needs to take steps to make sure that people in other sites don't succumb to the same kind of hazard or risk. So getting the terms of reference right to make sure that the breadth of that investigation is correct is a vital first step and really should be done within the first 24 hours.
So can we unpack blame? Talk to me about blame and why.
I didn't realise this was a psychiatry episode, Alex. It's interesting, isn't it, that humans like to exculpate themselves and they like to find a ne'er-do-well or a bad person who's to blame for something. And what typically happens in an immediate accident investigation is that the person who's suffered harm or their friends who've been their workmates have been trained. There's a risk assessment or a process that they should follow, and then they've not followed it. And the easy answer on any incident investigation is to go A plus B equals blame, because you've been trained, you've been risk assessed, and you didn't do it. And what that entirely forgets is that there must be a reason why they were errant. And I suppose we've adopted something from neurolinguistic programming, which is that when people do something, it always makes sense to them at the minute that they do it. So the question then is why they've done what they've done.
And you mentioned before the podcast that there's a lot of commentary around this from safety scholars, and you mentioned Sidney Dekker. Do you want to unpack that a bit more?
Well, Alex, given that you're Australian, we thought we'd bring Sydney into it. There's a new wave of safety scholar. Sidney Dekker's maybe been around 20, 30 years. Todd Conklin is an American thinker. David Provan as well. And what they've tried to encourage people to do is to look at this kind of drift towards failure, this normalization of deviance. Dekker wrote a book called The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error, which is a really important book in looking at why people do what they do. And the encouragement really from both Dekker, Conklin and others is to not see workers as the problem, but to see them as almost the trigger of a latent condition. And there's a lot there for us to think about as if we want to stop the same thing happening. Because if all you want to do is change one person out, then the same latent conditions can affect the next person in the series, and we have the same problem. And we do sometimes see that in the UK. One of the aggravating factors in the UK for sentence is, has the organisation got a criminal record or has it done the same thing effectively before? And unfortunately, all too often, the answer is yes, which would suggest that they've not learned, maybe because they've taken an immediate cause problem, disciplined or fired someone, and then gone, well, okay, we've solved it now, and they've not.
So are there any other types of models that you want to talk about in relation to this?
Yes, so there's lots of models that we use. Swiss cheese being kind of the most well-known model. But it's important to realise that when things can go wrong independently, the Swiss cheese is helpful. But we also, and what's one I particularly like using is Jenga. So you can relate to the game, but also in the kind of the health and safety risk management perspective. I think if you look at it as if you take one piece of the puzzle out, it doesn't automatically mean that the whole tower will fall. It could be multiple sections that are pulled out, and eventually there could be an incident. So there are many kind of models that can be used. And it just depends on kind of the preference of the individuals investigating, but also what they want to get out of the investigation.
I think there's also a piece there, Alex, around in the terms of reference, what the organisation expects. So fishtail analysis, for instance, is something that I'm not particularly keen on, but a lot of organisations use it, and they may prefer their accident investigation report to look down that kind of fishtail, fishbone analysis as a conclusion. Other organisations say, well, if you can use the Swiss cheese of our directors, they'll be able to understand that. And you can do a really deep investigation report, which gets reduced down to 5 PowerPoint slides to talk to a board with. And actually, if they can see some kind of, here, we didn't do this, 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 and this at these various layers of defence, that enables us to visualise it. And that's enough at top level. So using the models, it can be helpful to kind of visualise where things are without getting too tied into it. I think the best way to visualize it from my perspective is a bit like an onion. You can kind of peel the layers back and you kind of get to the kernel of it. But each of those layers has been a defense that's been peeled back. I've never used onion theory. Maybe we should copyright that, Charlotte, as our next thing.
It sounds
You
like a
heard it
good
here
plan.
first. You heard it
I
here
think,
first, okay?
and some clients use the HSE, the domino effect, but that can be problematic in itself because it relies on one domino falling and then that resulting in the incident, which kind of focuses on one key theory. So yeah, that can sometimes be problematic as well.
So within everything we've discussed so far, what role does risk management play? Paul?
It's a good question. I think with risk management, you find that most of the organisations we work with are good organisations, and they all think that they've got processes in place. Where things tend to fall apart is assurance that processes that have been codified are actually in place. There's a very famous case over here 10 years ago for one of the sixth form colleges where the sentencing judge said it wasn't about the risk assessment because you got one. The problem was the absence of controls to make sure that the risk assessment was being qualified and was being acted upon. And we find that active risk management is different to risk management. Most organisations will have a process, they'll have that written down, but what they lack is the active risk management where they're checking constantly. Decker calls it chronic unease, and so does James Reason. This idea that I've got something, am I comfortable that it's actually understood and it's being followed?
Charlotte, anything else to add?
Yeah, I think what the most common issue that we find, just building on what Paul has just said, is training, making sure that staff are trained, but actually understand what that training means in practice, and that leads into kind of the competence issue as well, and making sure that the training is an ongoing development as well, as opposed to just a single moment in time.
So knowing this, how should organizations investigate?
What a good question. I think one of the key points is timelines, questions, and really trying to avoid looking through the lens of hindsight. We see a lot of organisations where they will have an internal investigation team who might know the people, and it's really easy to bring kind of conscious and unconscious bias to that, where actually they think, well, this person's always acted like this, so they must have done something safe this time, or this person's a bit of a joker, so they've probably acted unsafely. So actually that independence piece, and that may be for serious or fatal, that it's outside the organisation, but where it's something that may have disciplinary consequences, serious near miss, it might be about making sure the investigations are done by somebody who doesn't know the people who are involved.
Yeah, and that independence element to it as well, it adds a lot of weight when the report eventually goes to the board to say, well, actually, it's not somebody marking their own homework, it's somebody that's come in and that's done it. And what we do say is we're going to come in and do a full and frank investigation. We would really appreciate your full cooperation and access to anything that we need. And that's really helpful when you're explaining to the senior leadership team that we have done a full and frank independent investigation by Eversheds, which is really helpful in itself. And these are our findings, and this is what we're going to do going forwards to prevent it from happening again. And we've got a clear timeline of safety improvement plan and accountabilities attached to that as well.
So this next question is probably a bit not controversial, but something that's been on my mind. So have you ever experienced, or do you get pressure from the employer to blame someone when you're working on such a matter, and explain that?
I think that it's easy for organisations to want a quick solution. And I'm being a politician in the way I answer your question here, Alex, because the simple answer is yes, but we're not going to say that. The answer is that it's easy for organisations to go, well, this seems to be a really obvious place to stop. We'll suspend and discipline the individual, and that will solve our problem. So when we say, well, actually, no, we want to look a bit deeper. And I had someone actually say to me once, Paul, you can't see the wood for the trees. And the answer to that was, I think it's more you can't see the forest for the sapling, because there's all these kind of organisational factors behind it. but it looks very easy to just kind of go, oh, there's a young tree, we'll blame that instead. And normally people are the product of the entire organisation structure.
So I've watched lots of crime scene investigation drama on TV. My mobile phone has the ringtone of Law and Order, such as I'm a fan. Does your experience around crime scene investigations, does your experience mirror that?
Absolutely not. And I think there is a big misconception about investigations when there has been a workplace death or incident. And yeah, absolutely not. We don't wear white coats. We are there in the immediate aftermath, and we do facilitate in the background with the clients in terms of their response to the regulatory investigation. But no, absolutely not. Yeah, I think we have to, when we go in, we do have to say, look, this is absolutely nothing like what you see on TV. So yeah, and we will never approach that in the same way.
What I would say though, Alex, is that where there are technical matters, so sometimes you literally cannot work out why a component has failed, you can't work out why an explosion's happened, and we will get a subject matter expert to help us, but they are very rarely going to be there in the immediate aftermath. So there's a big thing in health and safety investigations of reconstructions. In the UK, the Health and Safety Executive got its own laboratory in Buxton, which does a lot of this kind of work. And as the workplace employer, you would normally try and reconstruct as best you can the failure mode so that you can understand and keep in track in parallel what's happening. So whilst we're very rarely with the white gloves on, sifting through the wreckage, we will often get an external in to help us with that. I'm sorry if that's disabused you of any notions of our credibility there.
No, but another cheeky follow-up question. So have you ever been tempted to hide documents if it doesn't help your clients win the case?
There have certainly been some moments when I've put my head in my hands and gone, oh no. I tell you the kind of thing that, because this is useful, of course, to people listening, they go, well, what can we do better? The thing that as a lawyer terrifies you, because there are some standard questions. Can I see the risk assessment? Can I see the training? Can I see any recent audits? Can I see any recent reviews? When you get an audit that might be 5 years old that says this organisation has a problem with risk assessments because they're not fit for purpose, and then you see that finding repeated 2 years before the incident, and then you can't find a risk assessment, that's one of those moments when you're like, this is a very unhelpful document and it's going to cost my client millions of pounds. And I'm not saying I've ever been tempted to hide that. Clearly, I would never do that. But there's certainly been moments when I thought it would be much better if this document didn't exist and we're really going to struggle to explain it. And with all these things, you've just got to front it up and explain where you are, tell the truth. But again, when you're reporting upwards to a board of directors, that can be a really difficult message because then, of course, they're looking for a scapegoat because it's like, well, how on earth did we not follow this audit report? Why did the Director of Health and Safety not do this? And quite often it's because they weren't resourced properly and it's a systems point. But there's certainly a number of points when you're just like, this is going to be tough. Charlotte, I don't know if you've ever had anything where you're like, oh no.
Yeah, no, I haven't. No, but I think just following on from that, that the health and safety executive have powers to require you to provide documents to them. They ask for it voluntary. If it's not provided, then they go through the Section 20 powers. And we have questions from the client all the time. This is a really bad document. What are we going to do with this? Do we have to share it with the HSC? And our response is, well, it's not legally privileged. You do. When do we need to provide it? Because we kind of want to make it better. And our response is to that, well, we need to explain the narrative behind it in terms of this is the document that was in place at the time of the incident, but this is what you now have in place post-incident, and explain the narrative behind it to try and mitigate against all of the terrible stuff that's within the document. So we have those sorts of questions as well, but absolutely not. No, we've not. Yeah, we've not had, nor would we ever mislead a regulator.
I tell you the other thing, Alex, that can sometimes happen, and this is a really delicate line, is when there's been an incident, the regulator then requests documents, and a client has produced something in the aftermath of an incident, and they would like that document to have been produced before the incident. And effectively, the de facto question that they're not quite asking you is, can we show this piece of paper that we've written in the hours afterwards and pretend that we wrote it a day or two before? To which the answer is no. But you can see that, but humans don't want to be blamed, and so you can see those kind of human tendencies come out quite often.
So it's clear to me that you don't hide documents and there's no funny business going on with that. Investigations are thorough, but I can imagine, and I've never done this, obviously, I've never interviewed a witness to a serious incident. So how do you get the best evidence from people to then get to the bottom of the matter and to get to the truth?
Yeah, I mean, witnessing an incident in itself can be very, very traumatic, and you have to approach it very delicately. Obviously, you need their consent to make sure they're happy to speak with you, and timing's key as well. Obviously, you want to get their evidence as early as possible, but if they're not well enough to be able to share their version of events with us, then obviously we have to wait. But I think for me, it's just be human. Um, just be there listening to kind of what they've got to say, and not interrupting them as well, because you may have your preconceptions as well about what's happened in terms of the incident, but they may have a different version of events. So definitely the key takeaway for me is just to be human, and just be uh, as nice to them as possible. I think there's also a misconception amongst some individuals that we speak with that, oh God, solicitors have come in, we've done something wrong, we're going to be blamed, and they automatically come into the meeting quite difficult, not deliberately, but I think they're worried about their personal position. So I think at the outset, if we can say, look, you've got nothing to worry about. Anything you're saying here is confidential. If there's anything that you want to share that you're worried about, please do so. But equally, if they've not done anything wrong, then to let them know there's no personal liability on you. And as soon as you say that in a meeting, you can just you automatically see them relax, and that then helps them be much more open in terms of what they're willing to share.
So you're demonstrating empathy and understanding
Yeah.
and really trying to, I guess, use a lot of emotional intelligence, but sometimes people still get upset.
Oh, absolutely.
What do you do in that scenario if you're trying all the tricks and understanding of human people? Like how do you manage that?
So that the pre-COVID, we always used to conduct these face to face because you can identify non-verbal indicators that somebody's getting upset. Um, we try to avoid the use of Teams in these scenarios, and most of the time when there's been an incident, we are always on site anyway. But yeah, just making sure that we are looking after them as an individual. So the employer still has a duty of care to make sure that staff are looked after, and that we're managing their mental health and well-being post-incident. So it's just making sure that we can have a cup of tea or a drink. You can have a break at any time, and that it's okay to be upset, and reinforcing as well the EAP programs and the support that's in the background for that particular individual, which people we speak to don't like to use, but I think it's continually reinforcing that, look, there is available, you can have support post incident for you as an individual.
Yeah, Becker, Alex talks. He wrote a book called Secondary Victim, which looks at the people who get left behind. So the person who presses the button when something awful happens, the people who witness a fatality from a pedestrian segregation point of view. And he's very clear, and we'd endorse it, that making sure that there is adequate counselling provision, and it's not just call a phone number and you'll be all right, Sonny. And it much more integrated CBT, MCBT, whatever it might be, EMDR, to try and help people really understand that in many ways they are just the sharp end of a process that's got deep roots, or something bad's happened, but to get beyond the blame in their own personal lives. Because there have been a number of cases where someone who's an eyewitness or an unwitting actor has gone on to develop a serious mental health problem, or even in some cases taken their own life. So that support around the person who's upset is vital. And it's also worth remembering that that doesn't always have to be evidenced by someone being in floods of tears. People's behaviour change, becoming abrupt or withdrawn, are also things that a mindful employer will consider as an output of this process.
So we've spoken about interviewing and understanding the good, the bad, but then there's the silent. So how do you get to get people to talk to when they don't necessarily want to talk or necessarily want to tell the truth? Like how do you manage that scenario?
Again, I think if there's a culture of people being blamed, people sometimes remember an incident how they want to. The amount of times that you're talking to someone who's been an eyewitness and they paint their own actions as almost heroic. Sometimes the bionics of it would require a Marvel superhero to have actually accomplished what they say they've done, and they're completely incongruent with maybe CCTV of what actually happened. So there are two ways really. Uh, Some lawyers would say, well, you'd say to people, you owe us a duty under your employment contract to cooperate with an investigation, and therefore you'll cooperate. I find that that results in very stilted conversation and very minimalistic answers. I think it's much better to say, look, just tell me what happened from your perspective, and then not write anything down. Just kind of let them tell their story and then drill into it. Maybe that time, maybe the next time, but you've got to build your own credibility up. And sometimes it's important to get the buy-in of senior managers to go, look, you know, Alex is a witness to this, but we're not looking at disciplining him personally. I can give you that assurance. And if I can give that assurance to you, that might make you more comfortable. There's also a place, Charlotte, for them being accompanied.
Yeah, so we do offer, if individuals want to have a union representative with them, that's absolutely fine. Equally, just somebody there to provide a bit of pastoral support with them for them. So somebody from HR, or a colleague that hasn't been that hasn't been involved in the incident and hadn't witnessed it. So that's absolutely fine. It's somebody there, just a bit of a support mechanism for them.
So in your experience, have you seen an employee go to prison? And if so, like how, or in that scenario, how are individuals treated by the regulators?
Yeah, so when the regulator, so the police investigate gross negligence manslaughter, and they will go in and they will gather witness evidence to understand kind of what has happened. And that may then trigger, well, actually, that there is an individual within the organisation that has kind of breached a duty of care, and that has then led to somebody's death. So employees owe a duty to make sure that they keep themselves safe, but also others safe as well. So that there will always be a lens in terms of whether there has been an individual failing. Majority of the time, it's corporate failings, but it does happen. There are investigations. We've had a few recently where there was a fatal incident and a manager was interviewed separately, and that was problematic for them. We had to get a separate representation for them, and it was a very, very traumatic experience for them. But the HSE does prosecute individuals, and yeah, it does happen.
I guess the interesting thing, Alex, is the difference between the threshold for prosecution and conviction versus the public perception. Um, the bar really is, has someone done something that's truly awfully bad or reckless? That tends to be the bar where you look at it and you kind of wince and you go, "Blimey, heck, why on earth did you do that?" Or for a long period of time, someone didn't put guarding on a machine and carried it being unoperated anyway. It's very rarely the case where someone makes an inadvertent mistake, they don't follow a process quite right and press a button when it should be isolated. That's not the kind of thing that gets prosecuted. It's much more. There's a case at the moment in the UK, a corporate manslaughter case, where an individual's being prosecuted for manslaughter, where a poor chap was working on the top of a waste cutter without any guarding and with the thing not isolated, and he falls in and gets awful injuries and effectively cut up by the machine. The owner then remarkably takes the waste to a waste disposal site and dumps it with the human remains inside. And then when the individual's family inquires to the whereabouts of their beloved, the manager lies and said that he last saw him walking up the street at lunchtime. On any metric, that is truly awfully bad, and you should be prosecuted for that. Absolutely. That's not the same as someone not following a procedure properly or not wearing a PPE.
So I wasn't expecting that. That's quite the example.
Well,
Wow.
there you go. I should have finished my stories with Alex. They don't all live happily ever after. But that is a case that's going through the English courts at the moment. But on the facts as they are, you look at it and go, well, as presented in the news reports, those kind of cases are always right to be examined in a criminal court to determine the rights and wrongs of the evidence. But that's the evidence that's currently ongoing. So those kind of cases are always going to be prosecuted if they're correct or incorrect to determine the truth.
So talk to me about findings in an investigation. So you've interviewed people, you've reviewed the matter, you've reviewed the processes, you've written the report, you've delivered your findings. Is it always well received?
Good question, and the answer is not always. Most of the time it is, but not always, unfortunately. But I think, as I said at the start, when we go into the investigation process, we always say we are going to undertake a full and frank investigation. You may not like the findings, but the findings will be based on the evidence and our analysis of the evidence. We do get pushback in terms of, well, do you think this is right? Do you think that individual's account was right? And I suppose we approach on the basis, well, that is their truth, and we have to. People may be mistaken, but that is their evidence, and that is how they would give their evidence to the regulator. So we do get pushback. 9 times out of 10, most people are happy with our reports. But I think the issue is that we find in terms of, well, we've produced a safety improvement plan that can cost money to implement. So that takes resource away from other initiatives that they're working on. And we always say to them, look, these are our recommendations, and you can by all means do a cost benefit analysis, but this is our suggestions in terms of how you can improve your safety management system. 9 times out, a lot of the times as well, we found that accountability isn't right. Either in terms of the accountability sits with the wrong person, but equally an individual doesn't understand what their accountability is, so they can't act on what they should be doing. Our reports sometimes make people a bit nervous in terms of what the findings are, particularly where people could feel a bit uncomfortable in terms of, well, is this my fault? Is my job at risk? I mean, that's not our intention when we draft the reports, but there is a human element in it in terms of, could I have done more? If I did do more, would that have stopped the incident from happening? So there's always that self-reflection when we get a report. Yeah, so I'd like to say that 9 times out of 10 everyone's happy with our reports, but we do get pushback. And when we do get pushback, I think we have to say, well, look, this is where our independence comes in. We can't compromise that based on what you think the outcome should be.
And I think sometimes people look at proximate causes and go, well, we'll solve that. Whereas you're suggesting that we've got a problem with our culture. Culture problems are expensive to fix because it tends to be a root and branch reform, realigning the organisation. There was an example recently of a suicide case where a man fell to his death from an upstairs window, but the employer, rather than looking at the culture, which was alleged to be overwork and maybe some issues of bullying, the employer chose to change the window locks on upstairs rooms instead. So they went for the basic answer rather than looking at a more systemic one. I think the other point is that sometimes people just don't want to accept as a fundamental premise that we all make mistakes. And I've had that before from some chief executives where I'm worried that if we accept that people make mistakes, we're effectively writing a blank check for them to be able to carry on making mistakes, and that's all okay. And we sometimes see them make, I call it pot noodle safety, Alex. And there's another thing that I'm going to copyright. The idea that you can have something that's, it fills the spot, but the quality of it as a terms of a nutritious meal may be questionable. And sometimes the measures that people want to take are very much, we need to do something, but it might not have been fully thought through in terms of the wider piece and the minerals and vitamins that may come from it, so to speak.
So we have 2 new patented ideas. So that's beautiful for this podcast. Thank you very much, Paul. I'm loving it. Finally, coming back to Einstein's quote that we opened up with. So condemnation without investigation is the height of ignorance. What would be your one key takeaway you'd like to leave our listeners with? And I'll start with you, Charlotte.
Oh, this is so you put me on the spot then. I've got a bit of a mind block. My one takeaway is it's okay. So when there has been an incident, it's okay for everyone to have that self-reflection. And but I think no, hang on, delete that. My one takeaway, would you leave the listeners with? Paul, you go first, and then I can
Okay,
lean into
fine.
yours.
Okay, let's do the question again, and
the question
we
again.
can cut it then. Yeah. Over to you, Alex. Do you
So
want to do the question again?
I'm centering myself. No. Okay, so 3. Finally, coming back to Einstein's quote that we opened up with, condemnation without investigation is the height of ignorance. But what would be your one key takeaway you'd like to leave our listeners with? And I'll start with you, Paul.
My takeaway would be, it's really easy to start an investigation blaming a human actor, and that is condemnation without investigation. And we have to move away from a default of, we find the bad apple, we throw away the bad apple, or we cut out the bit that's wrong and then we fix it. And I think it's desperately important that organisations look more widely at the systems issues than just automatically assuming someone's an idiot and that's why something bad has happened.
My key takeaway would be make sure that you undertake an insightful, full and frank investigation, and to look at the safety improvement plan and to really engage with it and make sure that you are implementing what is achievable, but equally what is capable of improving the safety management system.
Paul and Charlotte, I've learnt so much, and I hope our listeners have as well. Thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to doing it again.
Thank you
Thanks,
for having us,
Alex.
Alex.
Yeah.